Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us for our first webinar of 2026. If you caught that short video before we began, you just saw some of the organizations that Forum One is proud to work with, from foundations and nonprofits to government agencies and cultural institutions. We've had the privilege of partnering with many of them for more than a decade, helping amplify their impact through strategic digital solutions. Before we get started, I'm going to go over a few quick housekeeping items. First, thanks again for joining us live. You will receive a copy of today's webinar recording in your inbox, so you don't have to worry about jotting it all down in real time because you'll have it all covered. Second, we're gonna save time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, so go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box below anytime during the session, and we'll take them in the order that they come in. And then you're also welcome to use the chat throughout to share comments, reactions, or ideas. Just make sure you send it to everyone because oftentimes it'll just go to the host. So send it to everyone so that everyone can see what your thoughts are. For those who are new to Forum One, we are a full service digital agency that helps mission driven organizations expand their impact through research, strategy, design, technology, and data. We have been doing this work for 30 years now, which is crazy, 30 years this year, and have completed more than 2,500 projects for over 1,000 organizations, including work at the forefront of digital transformation and emerging technologies like AI. At the heart of it all, our goal is simple. We partner with organizations as trusted experts to turn ideas into impact. So who's speaking today? I am Cassandra Swenson, the enterprise marketing manager here at Forum One. I've been with the company for almost 10 years, and one of the things I love most is getting to work with and learn from our experts as we help organizations navigate the rapidly changing digital landscape. I'm joined today by Stephen Bond, our VP of Strategy. Stephen advises mission-driven organizations on digital strategy and transformation. And fun fact, he is an avid world traveler, my go-to for any travel tips. And last but certainly not least is Tim Shaw, our senior UX director. Tim develops executive level digital and UX strategies with a knack for information architecture, data viz, and governance. And yes, well-timed puns. So he might have some in today's webinar for you. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Stephen to get us started with today's agenda.
Awesome. Thanks, Cass. So yeah, we're gonna walk through some information about how people understand and take in data and translate that to meaningful action. We're then gonna walk through some different types of data interactions and data interfaces. We'll talk about some lessons learned from our own work and from observations from the field. And then we want to give you something kind of tactical and tangible that you can take away to your own work. So we're going to talk about 5 common challenges and some different solutions we've observed. And then, as Cass said, we'll hold about 25 minutes for Q&A. So we'd love to answer your questions. And we're going to talk about this to start out the year because I think we've seen this was a big trend over the last 2 decades. We're proud to have worked with AARP's Livability Index and City Health Dashboards and many other organizations who have worked to make information more accessible to audiences. And over that period, we've learned a lot, and UX and communication researchers have learned even more about how people use those tools and take in information. And so we felt like this was a moment to start off the year where people were looking to make what they have more effective, to find new strategies to change behavior or support audiences, and to be more responsive to audiences. And so hopefully you can leave today and this will set you up to do that. And so I want to start by introducing a helpful concept that we'll use for evaluating different data products. It's called the DIKW hierarchy, and it explores how we transform raw, unorganized data into information, knowledge, and wisdom. So the DIKW comes from the 4 different levels: data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. It's important to call out people aren't AI, they aren't computers. They don't do this in a perfectly linear way. It tends to be more an iterative process. People can enter or do these things in different stages, not necessarily coming in on data and leaving with wisdom. But the hierarchy is a really helpful tool for understanding the stages of user behavior. And then as you're designing things, thinking about, am I supporting people in all of these stages in the journey? Am I skipping one? And perhaps that's why something isn't working as I would like. And so it's a really, we find a helpful tool. And I recognize that this can sound a little bit academic, but it's actually really quite simple. So, as an example, if we wanted to think about GPS coordinates, I think we all use them all the time in Google Maps or things like Waze. But a GPS coordinate on its own would be an example of data at the bottom of our pyramid. So, a GPS coordinate would be something like 40.74, comma, negative 73.98. And I think I'd be shocked. Feel free to put it in the chat. I bet you that doesn't mean anything to anyone because without additional information beyond just that coordinate, it's not very useful or not useful at all. And so really that next step of transforming data into information is key. And so when a map is given to you, you can all of a sudden take that GPS coordinate, that context that the map provides, and it becomes information. And so now you can identify where you are and how you might get to other places in relation to where you are. So in that example coordinate I gave, the map would help us know if it was a map of Manhattan, that that coordinate I gave is for the Empire State Building. And all of a sudden, that piece of data has a lot more value to me. And then the next step would be using the map multiple times to commute. And that turns the map and its routes into knowledge. So all of a sudden, I'm using that context I have and my coordinate, and I'm using it to go out and do something in the world. And through that, I kind of learn. While that way is shorter, it often has traffic. Or when I go that way, there's many people or it's not as scenic, things like that. So through experience, we're able to translate information. This is a route into knowledge of that route. And then finally, with enough of those three, so data, information, and knowledge, all of a sudden you're able to choose an optimal route or know what time you need to depart to arrive at a meeting somewhere else in the city on time. And because you now understand that data, you can take action based on it. So you could figure out that optimal time or when to leave, or perhaps schedule something for when it will have less time. And we would describe that as wisdom. So that's understanding and being able to take action based on data. And as communicators, what we don't want to do is give someone a piece of data when they don't have the information, the knowledge, or the wisdom to be able to interpret it. And so if you publish data, fund research, or steward public information, you may have faced some of the challenges I'm going to talk about in a moment. And hopefully that pyramid already is maybe sparking, oh, my tool does that well, but not this other step well. But we'll go into that in more detail. So in 2008 time period, there was a prevailing theory, along with the internet becoming more and more central to people's lives, people's work, that the reason we weren't seeing progress on issues we all cared about was asymmetric information. So people didn't have information in order to make better decisions. And the logic was if they knew their neighborhood was unwalkable or that their local school was underperforming, they would make better decisions. Perhaps they would advocate for change on walkability of their school, or perhaps they would move to somewhere else. And a core part of that kind of time period and thinking was this idea of nudges. And so make it really easy to know one thing, and we think that'll nudge you to take this behavior. And so this thought process and theory of change was actualized via many projects. One of those, the college scorecard. So you can see that on screen as an example. And there were various other dashboards. I think they did a great job in making information that was previously either completely unavailable or very hard and cumbersome to go and collect and put it all in one place. But it also can sometimes be overwhelming if I'm trying to make I'm sure many of us made college decisions, and I definitely didn't take such a logic and data-driven approach. It's probably doing a campus tour and meeting someone you liked, or because you had a family member who was an alumni. And so while this information could be helpful, I think we are going to talk a lot about today that deriving meaning from it or wisdom from it takes a little more effort, and just data alone maybe doesn't solve problems. And so looking back at that DIKW hierarchy, as I talked about, many dashboards created. COVID dashboards, education dashboards, health dashboards, walkability dashboards, so many of those products available now. And I would say they definitely do a good job of taking data that previously maybe wasn't easily available and making it easily available to people. And I would say they go even further than that. They often are able to give context of this is below average for your state or below average for the nation or above average, things like that to help you interpret it. But where I think there's an opportunity sometimes for them to do more is supporting going from just understanding the data, having a map or at that information level, and moving over to actually having knowledge. Okay, so now I don't just know the information, I've thought about it, I've analyzed what it means for me, and then I arrive at wisdom. I can apply it in some way. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for existing dashboards or new products to do more in those areas, which we'll talk about. But before we do that, I want to pass it over to Tim, who's going to walk us through some of the common types of data products you may experience.
Thanks, Stephen. So I apologize. I've gone off video here. My internet was a little unstable. So let's make sure we understand the scope of data products. I always love a good framework to understand an information space, and this 2x2 matrix is a useful one. The vertical axis borrows from data visualization leader John Schwabish. It runs from explanatory products, those which walk readers to some conclusions, to exploratory products, those that allow a reader to interact with the data to find one or more of their own conclusions. On the other edge, there's a spectrum from simple to complex in terms of the depth of the experience. And so we're left with four types of data products, and I'll go into each in a minute. But in general, you can see that explanatory products are built around some form of narrative or story that weaves the data into a flow-through experience. Exploratory products, though, generally present data and provide tools to allow users to digest and analyze that data in their own ways. The classic example of a simple explanatory data product is an infographic, often using vibrant and playful imagery. Pieces like this put data in some context and step readers through some simple framing or analyses to reach some form of a conclusion. Now, this example has a lot going on visually, probably too much, but notice that it leads with some compelling statistics. This is around obesity that give a reason someone should care about the topic. And then it outlines tangible actions that are needed. This isn't just about showing data, it is about making an argument for behavior change in an audience-friendly way. Note that it's too easy to get lost in fancy graphics on such products. You really need to have a clear eye on your audience and your purpose and do no more than is required. Now, Waze, the kind of tool to which Stephen alluded earlier, may be a less obvious example, but it absolutely fits. Think about it. The app uses tons of data, but that is all hidden from the user. What the user sees is an explanation of the data. In this case, the best routes among myriad options. Along the way, it gives small amounts of additional data, accidents, road work, and such. And occasionally, it even alters the explanation, that is, the route, in real time, based on new data that is, again, presented only at the most distilled level. Simple exploratory products maybe go beyond mobile apps, certainly do, but these are two useful examples. The simplicity is coming from A, having a fairly moderate amount of data that is well understood, and B, providing a limited set of known ways to explore it. So take the weather app, which does this well. People generally understand the weather and have a common set of use cases to explore it. They might want an afternoon forecast to see if their bike ride is still on, want the radar to see if that rain band is going to impact their commute, want predictions for 8 days out because friends are coming to town, or want the outlook for some other place to which they're flying. The app provides avenues for each at multiple levels of detail and allows the audience to easily answer the question they may have at that moment. The second case, an ESPN.com gamecast, also provides a moderate amount of data in a well-organized way. Note, though, that this display requires much more specialized knowledge. It's all useful, interesting information, but it's really only for true football fans. Now, it serves a much more specialized audience, which in this case matches ESPN's target audience. So that works. Complex explanatory pieces can be interesting and effective ways to convey important information, and they can also easily lose their way amidst design and technical flexing. Where an infographic is generally a static piece, these are interactive and multimedia products. By engaging with them, the reader is taken on a journey through a multi-part story that makes the data clearer and puts it in context. This first example is from a Guardian piece a few years back that reports on cities busing their populations of unhoused people out of town to other places. It does a great job of combining journalistic writing with interactive data visualizations and videos showing human stories. The data become tangible through the faces of real people who give weight and meaning to the large set of numbers. The data, though, is still core. This map tracks the movements of individuals over a 6-year span, providing steadily increasing numbers to show the magnitude of the problem. Readers likely didn't seek this piece out, but when it came to them through their other reading, it was accessible and compelling to a wide variety of audiences. On the other hand, we have a fancy annual report from BMW. It's highly polished and interactive, and it also walks through the material. But is it really more than someone's pet project? Do annual report readers really want all this? This is where things have likely gone too far. Finally, we have complex data explorers, dashboards, or browsing tools. These typically have a lot of data and allow for disaggregating, filtering, sorting, visualizing, and downloading. For audiences that do understand the array of data and know how they want it, what they want of it, they can be powerful tools for supporting in-depth work. Now, these two cases come from the US Department of Education work on which I'm involved. The first is the State Profiles product for exploring National Assessment for Educational Progress, NAEP, data. We have many key audiences who are focused at the state level. And while there are some enhancements I'd love to make to this product, it still organizes the data into understandable use cases and makes the options for drilling down clear. It has a structure geared to the audiences, the questions they have, helping them target their exploration within a large amount of data. The second case is a tool for showing many data sets regarding education after the COVID-19 pandemic. There's some organization, but it's mostly a long series of charts to scroll through. It's valuable data, but you really have to know what is there and how you might use it. Absent that, it's information overload with nothing close to a takeaway. So one key in this discussion is that you need to know who you want to reach. The less specialized, less expert the audience, the more you need explanatory products. Consumers or the general public need the guidance these products supply. Complex exploration is really for interested experts only. You also need to know the outcome you want. If you want to compel quick action, stay simple and explanatory. If you want deeper understanding, complex explanatory, simple exploratory pieces can do this. Simple exploratory tools in the right context can also help people accomplish key tasks. Those complex exploration products, again, generally support deeper research and decision making. They may bring about change, but over a longer time frame and through diffuse channels. So Stephen's now going to turn us to how we can better meet the opportunities that data offers.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. So now we want to talk about 5 things that can get in the way of your data having impact and some strategies for overcoming them. And so the first one I want to talk about is what's known as the last mile problem. The term is borrowed from telecommunications and refers to that final leg, that last mile, that is the hardest in getting broadband internet to rural communities. But I think there's some similarity and analogy here in that last step of getting people from knowledge to wisdom is really the hardest one and can take a lot of iteration and testing. So looking at this one, there's a couple of different solutions we see. Um, the last mile, I think it's key to recognize, isn't about making the presentation of data clearer. It's about making the insight bigger than the effort required to find it. And some ways you can do that are one, don't lead with naming the tool and instead lead with a headline. So instead of perhaps calling the dashboard regional housing stats, use housing supply is failing to meet demand. Tell people what they're going to learn or the problem they're going to be able to explore through looking at this data. Next, a number in isolation has no meaning. So always seeking to provide a benchmark. So instead of saying your rate of that issue is 12%, it's your rate is 12%, which is 4% higher than the national average, but it's also 2% lower than it was a year ago. And I think that kind of thing stays where some of our the organizations we work with need to in being nonpartisan, but allows you to give context and meaning to the data you're providing. And you can also, rather than having a simple experience, offer layers of complexity designed for different users. So Tim talked about some different kind of audiences and what best suited them. I'm a big fan of interfaces where you're trying to work with multiple audiences, allowing you to turn on complexity if you want it, but starting from a place of simplicity. So even if it's the expert using it, they can at least start by getting oriented.
So another challenge is the neutrality trap. And I see this a lot. It's reflected in this paraphrase. Organizations want or need to be strictly nonpartisan. So they lean away from anything but a rote restatement of the data. And Stephen was getting at that. The, the problem is that absent an authoritative explanation, any gaps in understanding might be left unfilled, or worse, be filled by non-authoritative voices. Let's dig in a little bit more on this one. Take the Johns Hopkins COVID data, which explicitly didn't include anything but the number of cases. That left many to wonder what these numbers meant. Is this okay? Is this a big problem? Do I need to worry and act differently? These numbers alone did not provide enough information, so others filled the gap with decidedly mixed results. The wisdom that people really needed got garbled. So what can we do? Organizations can and should do more than just reporting data and creating understanding gaps. First, I'd argue that there's a difference between using data to define a set of actions to take and giving a fuller interpretation of it. You can lean into providing takeaways, correct ways to read the data without crossing over to a slant. Now, more on this in a moment, but as Stephen suggested, providing objective context and benchmarks is staying true to providing unbiased information, and it provides much more understanding. Second, many organizations could do more to bring in other objective authoritative data into a picture that can provide this context. This starts to create wise actions without landing on any one side of the proverbial aisle. So for example, Johns Hopkins could have brought in insights from other epidemics and used that to say, at X point in a number of cases, history shows why things happened, and we crossed that point for COVID last week. Another idea is cultivating partners who can say more. Work with other trustworthy organizations to help them find fair interpretations of the data they can weave into their work and expand on in useful ways. This fills the understanding gap in ways that may avoid organizational discomfort. What this neutrality trap discussion suggests is that we move from exploration to explanation, especially for non-expert audiences. Remember, non-experts need to be able to make sense of what you're conveying, or they won't be able to or desire to make use of your work. What are some steps you might take? One is to focus on telling stories with data. When we worked with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, a government agency, we helped them define explanatory products to go alongside the dashboards they wanted to offer. So this first screen you see is pretty much the data dashboard from central casting, a bunch of data with some filters and only a loose organization. The report, though, has a flow. It prioritizes, giving just a small number of top takeaways from the data it's presenting. And the design supports use for those who are seeking quick answers and meaning. And its bold headlines make it highly scannable. Now, even better would be to imbue the human stories that add kind of color to the explanation, a la that Guardian piece. That would give additional power to the overall narrative. Though we know that this may be where some organizations bring in partners to add this additional dimension. A tactic that is achievable for most organizations, though, is to give context to data via benchmarks and/or comparators. This first chart is from NAEP. These score trend lines can be pretty abstract. We have the NAEP achievement levels that provide benchmarks and thus more meaning. So you can see one implication is that the 25th percentile basically hit the NAEP basic benchmark in 2022, meaning a quarter of students didn't even meet that lowest standard. That context now gives the abstract score some weight. The second chart is from the NTI Index of Nuclear Threat Readiness. Across some indicators, I can see how Morocco did. To put these scores in context, though, there are high, low, and median values, and I can easily add peers to better understand how well Morocco is doing. Now, note that our research determined that users would have clear ideas of their own of which comparators that they want, so we let them pick. If there had been a small number of known comparators, adding them as defaults might make more sense. Sometimes it's just about being specific with a valid takeaway, spelling out the conclusion clearly. This is the snapshot page from NYU's Congressional District Health Dashboard. And you can see that we provide the data points for the different metrics, but then clearly mark relative performance with both symbols and with a statement. There's sometimes a reflex to just put a lot of data into a visual in the name of simplicity and assume readers will sort it out. In general, please don't do this. Many audiences can't and won't sort it out. Often, it's better to break apart data into digestible chunks and provide annotations to add meaning. These examples are from NAEP. The first is actually one we did not use. We just showed these numbers as a plain table. But I did usability testing afterwards and showed this version was actually much more effective than the table. Why? Because people could confront the elements in series and build up to seeing the long trend, or in this case, a short trend. We're now looking at weaving this understanding into future work. In the second example, we're showing scores across percentiles, a concept with which some of our audiences struggle. So we add annotations here to help bridge the gaps in understanding, in particular to highlight lower performing students, a group on which we wanted to focus. The EPA tracks levels of known cancer-causing chemicals near industrial sites, but this data is not very useful for extracting meaning unless you are an expert. For a while, ProPublica was taking that data and putting it on a map. Suddenly, the hotspots jumped out. You could easily find your neighborhood or find neighborhoods that are at risk. It seems to be the case here in Port Arthur, Texas. It's basically the same data, but presented in a way that brought the problems home to individuals and local organizations and could prompt solutions. At the extreme, it is most impactful to design your data products to drive explicit actions. The first case is from the NTI index again. Because the index provides a framework for what policies and practices are ideal, one can look at a country, such as Morocco, and see specific areas it can improve and how that will impact their scoring. And because the score is a meaningful measure, increasing it directly leads to desired changes on the global scale. The second example is from NRDC, which is an authoritative voice with an advocacy mission. We helped them create this offshore drilling position tracking tool to help people easily find their elected representatives' positions on offshore drilling and instantly take action to contact them and advocate for the environment. Following on more data about the reasons to oppose drilling, this element moved from understanding to action. Stephen?
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. Next up, we want to talk about the importance of the messenger alongside the message. So we're seeing value in considering a shift from just publishing to more and more organizations partnering. So the delivery mechanism, the person or organization, can be just as important as the message, the data, and in achieving impact. And so a couple of different ways to look at this. One is messengers can translate technical data into specific values and language of their community. And that can be very powerful in making someone understand data or feel like it's relevant to them. There's also an opportunity to use this to kind of bypass bias. So information is more likely to be accepted, even if it's challenging information, when it comes from someone that the reader views as in their group as a source. And so that can be another powerful tool of kind of either building consensus or building coalition. And then the last would be action authority. A trusted peer can sometimes provide a specific ask. For example, we need to donate to this issue that a nonpartisan or not government agency just couldn't or wouldn't be appropriate to provide. And so you can see an example in the photo here of an influencer whose channel name is Your Rich BFF. And she does a wonderful job of delivering data to youth successfully. So I could see if you were the Fed or had economic data, partnering with her as a messenger would help that message get to the audience, but also make them care and help them understand what it means for them. And then our final kind of challenge or opportunity is sense making. And we think AI can play a big role in helping with what used to be a big problem for data products. And certainly wouldn't be 2026 if we didn't talk about AI, but we really think it can be a powerful tool in helping people understand data. But I do want to call out that to maintain trust, we view disclosure when and how AI is used as an essential part of this. But a few examples of what AI can do that maybe would have required a lot of time from humans are things like supporting natural language queries. So moving people from filters and sliders to asking a question about the data, something like, how does the new zoning law affect my commute? We also see that AI can be great at providing automated contextualization. So AI can bridge the DIKW gap by instantly synthesizing raw data into actionable information and knowledge. And then finally, we see hyper personalized impact being a really interesting area. So, translating massive data sets into what it means for you as a person without the user needing to be a data scientist. And so, I've included an example here on the right of a visualization. I'm sure we've all seen lots of visualizations with a chart. What's really interesting here with AI is you can ask it things like generate a forecast of where it's most likely to go if it continues to follow that pattern, or you can ask it to explain what's happening here. So AI could identify what are the other trends or patterns that are intersecting and leading this to happen. And that leads to a level of understanding or kind of moving up that pyramid, but the cognitive load of doing so, moving to something AI is good at, rather than placing it on the human to have to spend a long period of time really immersively going through the data in order to make meaning. And with that, I will pass it back to Cass.
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you, Tim. That was a lot of information. So, before we move on to questions, and y'all can go ahead and start putting in your questions in the Q&A box below. For everyone, this is for Stephen and Tim. For everyone else, if they only do one thing in the next, let's say 90 days or 6 months, what should they do? Like, what is their like first takeaway, biggest takeaway for to do next? Stephen or Tim, you want to go first?
Go ahead, Steve.
Sure. I think my two biggest takeaways, as Cass said, we'll be sharing this recording, but I think if you take a screenshot or pull from the recording, the pyramid and the Tim's kind of four box grid, they could be really useful either in evaluating your current data tools or as you plan a new data tool. I think I wish roughly 20 years ago when we started doing this work, we had this understanding of what worked well for what audiences and what were the steps people needed to take. And I think just having a framework to say, what am I trying to do? Then which kind of visualization is best suited for that? And making sure I answer audience questions probably doubles or triples the likelihood your first version is successful or has impact. And so hopefully that's a really useful tool for attendees.
I would say if you're not already, think carefully about like your audience and your goals and what you want your data products to do for you, and then think how you can ways you can move towards that explanatory way, unless your audience is truly interested experts.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, guys. So we're gonna jump right into Q&A. So feel free to drop them in. I had some sent to me, so I'm gonna go ahead and just start with those. The first one, Stephen, you can probably answer. How are you advising organizations to measure success when traffic is down, but influence may be up through AI and zero-click channels?
It's probably most of what I thought about last year and this year. I think my POV is tweaked slightly for these new channels, but is basically the same. I think using the pyramid, the grid that Tim had to define what success looks like. So, what is the tool meant to do? Is it just to know what's happening in my community, or is there some kind of action I want people to take? And mapping out the way people might get through that journey of taking action, I think has changed in 2026. So it might be that they ask a question either of GPT or on Google, and your information ends up in the AI overview. And then perhaps if there's action, there's a link very deep into your website to go and take that action. But I would still, I want, but previously, I would want to count how many people actually completed the journey. So I'm less interested in how many people start is a useful metric on needing to improve if lots of people start and most don't make it to the end. But what I'm most interested in is whether it's happening on a property the client owns or via these new AI tools. I want to be counting and measuring how many people successfully complete the goal of the product.
Awesome. And then our second question, and I, before we go to the second question, I am putting in some resources in the chat. If you want to hear from a peer, we had Mercy Corps on with us in late last year in November, talking about AI, discoverability, and everything. So I put a blog in there, and I'll put the webinar recording in next. But Tim, I think this next question is best for you. If our organization already has dashboards and reports, where do you typically see the biggest lift from small changes, content, UX, or governance?
Governance is always the sneaky unconsidered way to get a lot of impact, because a lot of decisions or reasons things end up in a certain place or around decision making. But um, if you have dashboards, I would think seriously about the tactic I mentioned with the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board. Is can you augment them with some explanatory products that, maybe over a period of time you focus on particular chunks of data that yes, they draw people back to the dashboard, but they also give people, more people perhaps, access to the data. So sort of doing a both and kind of strategy.
Awesome. Well, that is all the questions we have right now. So I guess you answered everybody's questions in the webinar. So great job,
Or we stunned them into
Stephen and
silence.
Tim. We're gonna go with you did a great job and covered it all. But we will have the webinar recording in your inbox soon, and then there'll be other resources coming. Like I share those the webinar and the blog and the chat, and then if you have other AI discoverability questions, there's a ton there. And then if you ever like specific like data questions or strategy questions, Stephen and Tim are your guys. So please reach out to us through our contact form. And thank you for attending again. We hope to see you next month. Bye,
Yeah,
everybody.
take care.